90 miles to Richmond. Chapter 1. Holding on in a dying land, near Falmouth, Kentucky, August 1862. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of parched earth and dying leaves. Frances Hardin stood in her dust-choked garden. The late beans, brittle and brown, the turnips strangled by cracked soil. Hezekiah Hardin's farm, they called it a patch in those days, was 60-odd acres. It was off the main road on the North Fork of Stoner Creek. It was so remote that few people passed that way. Frances wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, smearing dust into a streak. The river, too, had shrunk. It hadn't rained in 2 months. Late August in Kentucky was always hot, but that year the heat was a relentless enemy, slowly strangling the life from Frances Hardin's garden. A cicada whined somewhere close, its shrill call splitting the stagnant air. Frances didn't notice. She stared across the cornfield, beyond the woodlot. She gazed at the narrow dirt road winding toward town. She wondered where her husband was. He had joined the Union Army. She hadn't heard from him since he was home on furlough. Behind her, the house sagged in the heat, its unpainted clapboards baked gray by endless sun. Frances tucked a stray curl behind her ear and forced herself to stay focused. She and her husband, Hezekiah, had toiled together in April, during his furlough from the Union Army, planting tobacco and tending the garden. The back-breaking labor felt futile as their crops struggled in the drought. After all the sweat-soaked, bone-crushing toil, seeing her garden suffer for lack of rain was almost more than she could endure. How could they have known that there would be such a drought? Frances and her neighbors prayed every day for rain, but none came. For the last 2 weeks, from sunrise to sunset, Frances had worked. She and her family toiled in the grueling drudgery of the tobacco fields. They cut and hung the leaves to dry. Her husband's younger sister, Emily, and her brother Willie had helped her. Even her children had pitched in. 7-year-old boy James and 5-year-old Molly. Frances's mother-in-law, Ma Hardin, cared for her baby. The baby, Anne, was 18 months. Ma also looked after the rambunctious Molly. She was a whirlwind of red hair and incessant chatter. Poor Ma, that little Dickens. Molly kept her busy enough. She was either climbing, chasing, or getting into something she shouldn't. She ran like a deer, her red hair flying as she chased after the chickens or played with the dog. And talk. Oh, my goodness, she could talk. Her mouth never quit. She wanted to know about everything. Why do chickens peck? Is Tramp, the dog, going to have babies? When's Pa coming home? Why do cows give milk? What's for dinner? She only stopped when she was sleeping. Frances was grateful to have her mother-in-law with her. Rhoda Hardin, Rhoda's son Willie, and daughter Emily were there to help her. Willie was a bit slow and not always dependable, but all in all, he was a good boy. Sometimes Ma would send him back to their home place to check on things. He wouldn't come back until he'd eaten all the food she had sent with him. He could be a good worker when Ma was around to supervise him, but he didn't see things to do on his own. He was good enough and big enough to be of help when he wanted. If a stranger came and saw him there, they would assume that he was a formidable force. His presence provided a stopgap for the family. Frances was glad that Ma had been able to convince him that he should stay home with her and not join the army. She certainly could not have done all the work by herself. She knew it was hard for Ma to keep up with the cooking and the rest of the farm work at her age. She had noticed Ma complaining a lot more lately, but she allowed that she was worried about Pappy and Hezekiah. They would both feel better if they could have some word from them. There had been no word from anyone since Hezekiah had rejoined his company last April. Now that the tobacco work was finished, Frances hoped she could rest a spell. A trip to their home place or even a jaunt to Falmouth for supplies would be a welcome treat. Perhaps she could take Emily and the younger children, leaving Ma to rest. However, the trip might do Ma some good as well. Hizzy's foresight in selling their team to the Union Army before his deployment last January proved wise. The team would be a burden now, for there was no one at home to work with them. The remaining livestock needed the stored corn and hay, and the corn crop itself was threatened by the drought. If it didn't rain soon, the corn would dry on the stalks and not be worth picking. Frances guessed she would have to carry water from the spring to keep her garden from drying up. Hezekiah had tilled and built a small canal that carried water from a spring down the hill into a trough in the lean-to. The other wives in the vicinity were envious because Frances had running water. Hezekiah had known the hardship of having to tote water from the spring that was 300 yards away. Now Frances would be able to carry water from either the house or the spring, whichever was closer to where she needed it. Either way, it would be a hardship, but one Frances would be equal to if it meant having crops for the animals and vegetables for her family. Each morning she arose at dawn to set the coffee to brew for herself and Ma. She let Ma sleep in as often as possible to prepare for the hot, busy day ahead of her. She roused James and Emily to come and help her in the garden before the sun was too hot for them. Willie looked after the animals. Emily, who was 18, was growing more beautiful every day. She was tall and thin like her mother, but she had the deep blue eyes of the Hardin clan. Most of the young men were off to war, and she had little interest in those who stayed behind. Press enter or click to view image in full size. Photo courtesy of Graham Doyle, Pinterest, Morgan's Raiders, a reenactment. After the supper dishes were washed and put away, the women had a little time to sit and talk. These times, the talk inevitably turned to war. They all felt slavery was wrong and couldn't understand why so many people couldn't see that and were fighting so hard to defend it. After the young'uns had been shooed outside for a spell, the ladies liked to settle themselves in the front room. Willie was usually outside. He liked being with children. Frances sat by the hearth in her favorite chair, her brow furrowed. "Seems like everybody's talking about Morgan's raid these days," she said. "Folks along the big roads losing their cattle and horses, some even their corn and beans." Emily rocked slow in the chair by the window, smoothed her apron across her knees. "Some of them hot-headed boys even run off to join him, far as I heard," she said, her mouth drawn tight. "Always was something foolish. Riding off to war, ain't there? Like it's some grand adventure." Rhoda snorted, folding her arms across her chest. "Adventure, my foot. They think it's all flags flying and bugles blowing, till they get theirselves shot or come home missing a leg." Frances looked over at her mother-in-law, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Ain't many folks joining up, though. Leastways not here." Most folks I know are still loyal to the Union." Rhoda looked up from her knitting and nodded firmly. "That's God's truth. Kentucky might have said she was neutral, but you can't keep young men from picking sides. Brother against brother, father against son. It's a heartache no matter how you slice it." Emily sighed, leaning her head back against the wall. "I heard Morgan thought he'd raise himself a whole army here in Kentucky. Got hisself a few, but not near what he was counting on." Frances hugged her knees. "I reckon most folks just want the war to end, one way or t'other. We're all just tired. Tired of the fighting, tired of the talk, tired of wondering who'll come back and who won't." Rhoda leaned back in her chair, her voice low. "Aye, and when it's done, there'll be a heap of mending to do. Not just farms and houses, but hearts and families, too. God help us all." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock and the soft creak of the house settling into dusk. Author's note: this is the first chapter of 90 Miles to Richmond, based on a true story. My grandmother had a photographic memory. This story was told to her by her grandmother, Frances Hardin, who lived it.
Chapter 2. Pappy's Story. This family had seen danger before. In this short chapter, we hear the story of how he and a friend were chased by Indians and survived by quick thinking and a good hiding place. It's the sort of tale men used to tell after supper, half warning, half boast, and all true. Stories like this didn't make the newspapers, but they explain the kind of men who later marched off believing the war would be short.
Pappy's Story. He was Pappy to his family, but to many folks, he was known as Billy Blue Buck. His father, Saville Hardin, had made quite a name for himself as an Indian fighter, having served in the Revolutionary War. After the war, Saville settled down on a 600-acre claim along Snake Lick in Harrison County, Kentucky. As the story goes, young William, Pappy, and his good friend Elijah were off on a hunting trip when they stumbled into a Shawnee hunting party. The Shawnee had fought alongside the French during the French and Indian War and were none too friendly toward the British or their westward moving settlers. The boys immediately realized these Indians weren't the friendly sort. In fact, they were stirred up like a hornet's nest. Seeing they were badly outnumbered, William and Elijah lit out in a hurry, running for all they were worth. Being young and strong worked in their favor. They managed to stay ahead of their pursuers, who came after them like a pack of hunting dogs. As dusk closed in, the boys found a fallen hollow tree and crawled inside, figuring it was as good a hiding place as any. They hadn't even caught their breath when they heard footsteps crunching through the woods. They froze, barely daring to breathe, as the Shawnee warriors passed by, unaware of how close their quarry was. William and Elijah knew better than to risk moving. They worked to camouflage their hiding place as best they could. If they stayed put, there was still a chance they might slip away unseen. If they tried to run, they'd surely be caught. Their gamble proved right soon enough. The Indians, realizing they'd lost the trail, came back with howls and whoops that raised the hair on the boys' necks. One warrior prowled around the log, sniffing trouble. After a minute of looking, he let out a wild whoop, and 8 or so others came rushing over. They started stamping on the log and circling it, jabbering excitedly in their own tongue. Inside, the boys barely even blinked. They reckoned nothing but a thin shell of rotten hemlock stood between them and a grisly end. The Shawnee weren't about to give up. They jabbed arrows through the log, cutting small holes here and there, but somehow, by sheer luck or providence, William and Elijah stayed untouched and undiscovered. Still not satisfied, the warriors built fires at both ends of the tree, stoking the flames until the whole hollow glowed. They meant to smoke the boys out, or worse. Time dragged by, but somehow the smoke never filled the log deep enough to choke them out. Finally, the Indians gave up the chase. When the coast was clear, the two fugitives crawled out, coughing a little, but none the worse for wear. Thanks to the holes cut by their attackers, they'd had enough fresh air to survive. They didn't rightly know where they were, but looking around, they saw they were halfway up the side of a hill. They felt half dead, worn to the bone, but mighty thankful to still be among the living. Without wasting any time, they struck out for home, putting as much ground as they could between themselves and any lingering danger. Along the way, they spotted a big buck. Their muskets were still loaded, so they fired, wounding the animal, and gave chase. When they finally brought it down, they noticed something strange, a peculiar blue spot on its skin. They skinned the buck and saved the hide, and William later had it made into a fine buckskin jacket. It was that jacket, and the memory of the narrow escape, that earned William D. Hardin the nickname he carried for the rest of his days, Billy Blue Buck.